The chili burned, the mouth was on fire, the forehead sweated, the nose ran. Every signal said the tissue was being damaged by heat. You could feel the temperature rising. Except the temperature in the mouth never changed. A thermometer held against the tongue during the burn would read 37 degrees the entire time, the same temperature it read before the first bite. The burning was real, the heat was not. A molecule from the pepper activated the same receptor that detects scalding water, fitting the binding site so precisely that the receptor opened its calcium channel and fired the identical signal it would fire if the tissue were actually burning at 43 degrees. The brain received a temperature report from a molecule. The flush, blood vessels in the face and ears dilated to cool tissue the brain believed was overheating. The sweat, eccrine glands activated across the forehead, the upper lip, and the scalp, the same distribution the body uses during genuine overheating, deploying evaporative cooling to dissipate heat the body was not generating. The sweating is most intense on the face because the facial skin carries the highest density of eccrine glands, and the brainstem prioritizes facial cooling during perceived thermal stress. The nose ran. Mucous membranes in the nasal cavity increased secretion to protect the airways from the hot air the brain believed was arriving. The eyes watered. Lacrimal glands flushed the ocular surface against thermal damage that did not exist. Every thermal protection countermeasure the body possesses deployed against a temperature that was never there, because every countermeasure is triggered by the same TRP-VON signal, and the signal was indistinguishable from real heat. The hiccup that sometimes accompanies very spicy food is the diaphragm responding to what the brainstem interprets as thermal irritation of the pharynx. The stomach cramp is the gastric smooth muscle responding to what the gut neurons report as dangerously hot contents. Each response is appropriate for its trigger. The trigger was a forgery. The body has no mechanism to verify whether the TRP-VON signal originated from heat or from capsaicin, because the body never needed one. For the entire evolutionary history of the receptor, the only molecules that activated TRPV1 were temperature-related signals. Capsaicin is the first molecule in the receptor's evolutionary experience that produces the conformational change without the temperature. The forgery works because the receptor evolved in a world where the forgery did not exist. Plants evolved capsaicin as a deterrent for mammals whose molars would crush the seeds. Birds would swallow seeds whole and disperse them intact, lack the TRPV1 variant that responds to capsaicin. The molecule was designed to trigger pain in exactly the organisms that would destroy the seeds, using exactly the receptor those organisms rely on for thermal protection. 6 systems responded to one receptor. The receptor that detects dangerous heat was activated by a molecule that mimics the shape of heat. The tolerance you build through years of eating spice is cells pulling those receptors off their surface. The stomach you avoided spice to protect is actually protected by the molecule you feared, and if you cannot tolerate any spice at all, you carry a hardware difference in receptor count, mucosal thickness, or both, written before the first meal. What is the receptor, and how does capsaicin fool it? TRPV1, a calcium channel embedded in the membrane of sensory nerve endings throughout the mouth, the throat, the gut, and the skin. The channel sits closed at body temperature. When tissue temperature rises above 43 degrees Celsius, the threshold for potential thermal damage, the protein undergoes a conformational change. The structure shifts, the channel gate opens, and calcium ions rush through the pore into the nerve ending. The calcium influx triggers an action potential that propagates along the C-fiber pain pathway to the brainstem, arriving as a signal the brain reads as burning heat. C-fibers are unmyelinated, slow-conducting nerve fibers that carry pain and temperature information. The burn you feel from a chili arrives over the same neural pathway that would carry the signal from touching a hot stove. The brainstem receives both signals through the same fibers, encoded in the same frequency pattern, indistinguishable at the neural level. The brain has no way to know whether the signal originated from actual tissue damage or from a molecule that mimicked the conformational change that tissue damage would produce. The brainstem processes the signal through the spinothalamic tract, the same ascending pain pathway that carries all thermal nociceptive information from the body to the somatosensory cortex. The cortex maps the signal to the location it originated from, the tongue, the lips, the throat, and generates the conscious experience of burning at that location. The experience is generated from a signal. The signal is generated from a conformational change. The conformational change was generated from a molecule, not a temperature. But every step after the conformational change is identical regardless of what caused it. The receptor is a molecular thermometer calibrated to a specific alarm threshold. 43 degrees is the temperature at which protein denaturation begins in human tissue, the temperature at which cellular damage becomes likely. The alarm is set at the precise boundary between safe and dangerous thermal exposure. Below the threshold, the channel stays closed and no alarm fires. Above it, the channel opens and the brain receives a damage report that initiates protective withdrawal. You pull your hand away, you spit the food out, you move away from the heat source. The precision of the threshold makes evolutionary sense. The alarm must fire before damage occurs, and the thermal alarm threshold is the temperature just below the point of irreversible protein unfolding. Below it, the channel stays closed and no signal fires. Above it, the channel opens and the brain receives a thermal damage report. Capsaicin, the molecule that gives chili peppers their heat, fits into the vanilloid binding pocket on the intracellular face of the TRPV1 channel. The binding pocket is shaped to accept molecules with a specific geometry, a vanillyl head group connected to a hydrophobic tail through an amide bond. Capsaicin carries exactly this geometry. The molecule enters the pocket, contacts the binding residues, and produces the identical conformational change that heat above the thermal alarm threshold produces. The channel opens. Calcium floods through. The C fiber fires. The brain receives the same signal it receives from a thermal burn. The receptor cannot distinguish between the two inputs because the conformational change I is the detection mechanism. Heat produces the shape change. Capsaicin produces the same shape change. The downstream signal is identical because the upstream trigger, the conformational shift, is identical. A forged key that fits the lock heat was supposed to open. The lock cannot tell the difference because the shape of the key is the security mechanism. The lock detects keys by their shape. The forged key has the right shape. The lock opens. Every alarm downstream fires as though the real key turned. The forgery is so precise that no downstream system, not the brainstem, not the hypothalamus, not the autonomic nervous system, can distinguish the capsaicin-triggered signal from a genuine thermal damage signal. The only way to know the difference is to measure the actual tissue temperature, and no receptor in the body does that independently of TRPV1. The alarm system has no backup. If TRPV1 says the tissue is burning, the body believes it. Capsaicin's molecular mimicry of heat at the TRPV1 receptor is the foundational pharmacology of the chili response. TRPV1 responds to both capsaicin and temperatures above the thermal alarm threshold through a shared conformational mechanism. Katerina and colleagues identified this receptor in nature. The vanilloid binding pocket and the thermal activation domain converge on the same structural gate. Capsaicin's binding affinity and the receptor's thermal threshold share a molecular basis in the vanilloid binding pocket. Salassi and Blumberg described this pharmacology in pharmacological reviews. I experienced the thermometer paradox differently the evening the receptor physics replaced the word heat in my understanding of spice. The mouth was at 37 degrees. The C fibers were firing a thermal damage signal. The brain was reading thermal damage from tissue that was the same temperature it had been before the first bite. Every response I produced, the sweat, the flush, the nose running, the watering eyes, was my body deploying its thermal damage countermeasures against a temperature that existed only in the receptor's report. Receptor was fooled. Signal was real. Every downstream consequence fired as designed. But the tolerance that builds across months of spice eating is not a change in the molecule, the receptor, or the signal pathway. It is a change in how many receptors sit on the cell surface waiting to be activated. Why does the regular spice eater tolerate what the occasional eater cannot? 3 independent variables determine your spice tolerance, each operating through a different mechanism. Together they explain why the same dish produces a mild warmth in one person and an unbearable burn in another. Variable 1, receptor density. The number of TRPV1 channels per square centimeter of mucosal surface varies genetically between individuals. More channels means more binding sites for capsaicin, which means more simultaneous calcium influx, which means a stronger composite signal reaching the brain from the same capsaicin concentration. If you experience every jalapeno as intensely painful, you may carry a receptor density 2 to 3 times higher than your dining companion who eats habaneros without distress. The difference is manufacturing specification, determined before the first exposure, inherited like eye color or height. Hardware, written into the genome. Population studies show measurable variation in TRPV1 expression levels across ethnic groups, correlating with the prevalence of capsaicin-rich cuisine in ancestral dietary patterns. Populations with long histories of chili consumption tend toward lower average receptor densities, a selection effect. Individuals who tolerated spice ate more of the cuisine, consumed the protective gastric benefits, and passed their receptor profiles forward. The genetics and the cuisine co-evolved. Variable 2. Mucosal barrier thickness. The mucous membrane lining the mouth and stomach interposes a physical barrier between capsaicin in the food bolus and the nerve endings where the TRPV1 receptors sit. A thicker barrier slows capsaicin's diffusion to the receptor surface, producing a lower peak concentration at the binding site, which means fewer receptors activated simultaneously, which means a weaker signal. Chronic use of nonsteroidal anti-inflammatory drugs thins the mucosal barrier by suppressing the prostaglandin synthesis that maintains it. Helicobacter pylori infection erodes the barrier from below. Chronic stress reduces the mucosal blood flow that supplies the barrier's maintenance. Each factor independently thins the barrier and increases the effective capsaicin dose reaching the receptor for the same food. If you tolerated spice well at 40 and cannot tolerate it at 60, and you have been taking daily ibuprofen for the past 5 years, the change may trace to the mucosal thinning the drug produced rather than to a change in your receptors or your aging. The barrier thinned. The effective dose increased. The receptor count stayed the same. The tolerance dropped because the barrier that was buffering the capsaicin concentration at the receptor surface was reduced by the medication you were taking for something else entirely. Well, variable 3, desensitization. Repeated exposure to capsaicin causes the cell to pull TRPV1 channels off the membrane surface and store them inside the cell. Fewer surface channels means fewer binding sites, which means a weaker response from the same dose. The tolerance the regular spice eater has built across years of curries and hot sauces is measurable as a reduction in TRPV1 surface density on the mucosal nerve endings. The receptors are not destroyed. They are stored inside the cell. Stop eating spice for 6 months and the receptors reinsert into the membrane, the surface density climbs back toward its genetic baseline, and the tolerance resets. The practical consequence: tolerance builds through gradual repeated exposure over weeks, not through a single overwhelming dose. A small amount of chili added to each meal produces sustained low-level activation that triggers receptor internalization without the overwhelming pain of a high dose. The cells pull a few receptors off the surface with each exposure. Across 4 to 6 weeks of daily low-dose activation, the cumulative reduction in surface receptors produces measurable tolerance. If you tried a Carolina Reaper once and concluded you cannot eat spice, you tested the wrong protocol. The tolerance builds from the bottom of the Scoville scale upward, not from the top down. A mild salsa at 500 Scoville units added to daily meals for 2 weeks, then a medium hot sauce at 2,000 for 2 more weeks, then a jalapeno-based sauce at 5,000. Each step activates enough TRPV1 to trigger internalization without producing the overwhelming signal that a high dose generates. By week 6, the surface receptor density has reduced enough that the 5,000 unit sauce produces a mild warmth rather than a burn, and the next step on the scale becomes tolerable. TRPV1 desensitization through repeated activation follows this receptor trafficking mechanism through measurable changes in surface channel density. Sustained capsaicin exposure triggers receptor internalization, and the process reverses when the stimulus stops. O'Neill and colleagues documented this in Plurger's archive. Now, 3 variables mapped onto your own profile. Your genetic receptor count is fixed. Your mucosal thickness is modifiable. If you take daily ibuprofen and your tolerance dropped, the barrier thinned. Your desensitization is buildable, gradual, repeated exposure over weeks, pulls receptors off the surface and builds the tolerance the regular eater carries. Your position on the spice tolerance spectrum is 3 measurable variables, each one independently setting where you sit on the curve. You can test which variable dominates your own profile. If your tolerance dropped after starting a daily anti-inflammatory, the barrier thinned. If your tolerance has always been low, regardless of exposure history, your receptor density is likely high. If you tolerated spice well as a regular eater and lost the tolerance after months of bland food, your desensitization reversed through receptor reinsertion. Each variable responds to a different intervention, and identifying the dominant variable is what makes the tolerance buildable rather than fixed. Tolerance is cellular. Receptor count is genetic. The barrier is modifiable. 3 variables, each independently setting your threshold. And the assumption that spice damages the stomach, the reason many people avoid it, runs exactly backward through the physics of what capsaicin does to the gastric lining. How does spice protect the stomach? It seems to burn. Countries with the spiciest cuisines, India, Thailand, Mexico, Korea, have lower gastric ulcer rates than countries with bland cuisines, an observation that persists across multiple epidemiological studies controlling for other dietary and lifestyle variables. The observation seems paradoxical only if you assume capsaicin damages the stomach. The mechanism is receptor-mediated, and the receptor produces protection, not damage. Capsaicin activates TRPV1 on sensory nerve endings in the gastric mucosa. The activated nerve releases calcitonin gene-related peptide locally at the mucosal surface. Calcitonin gene-related peptide is a vasodilator. It relaxes the smooth muscle in the gastric mucosal capillaries, increasing blood flow to the stomach lining. More blood flow means more oxygen delivery, more nutrient delivery, and more substrate for the mucus-producing cells that maintain the protective barrier between the acid and the tissue. The gastric defense strengthens in direct response to capsaicin activation of the receptor the body uses to detect threats. Aspirin makes the physics specific through contrast. Non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs like aspirin and ibuprofen inhibit cyclooxygenase, the enzyme that produces prostaglandins. Prostaglandins maintain mucosal blood flow through a separate pathway from the protective peptide. When the drug suppresses prostaglandin production, mucosal blood flow decreases, mucus production decreases, the barrier thins, and ulcer risk increases. 2 substances in the medicine cabinet. The one feared, the chili, protects through increased blood flow via the blood flow signal. The one trusted, the aspirin, damages through decreased blood flow via prostaglandin suppression. 2 different molecules, 2 different pathways, opposite effects on the same mucosal barrier. The distinction is the pathway. The mucosal defense messenger and prostaglandins both maintain mucosal blood flow, but through independent mechanisms. Capsaicin increases blood flow through the vasodilator peptide pathway without touching the prostaglandin pathway. Aspirin decreases blood flow through the prostaglandin pathway without touching the protective peptide pathway. The 2 substances operate on parallel tracks that both converge on the same endpoint, mucosal blood supply. One opens the track, the other closes it. Capsaicin-mediated gastric mucosal protection through vasodilation, mediated by the protective peptide, is the established mechanism. Capsaicin-sensitive sensory neurons play a protective role in gastric defense through vasodilator peptide release and mucosal vasodilation. Holzer established this mechanism in current pharmaceutical design. My assumption about protecting my stomach inverted when the aspirin-capsaicin comparison reached specific pathways. The spice I avoided to protect the lining was increasing the blood flow that maintains the lining. The aspirin I took without concern was suppressing the prostaglandin that maintains it through a different pathway. The feared substance protected, the trusted substance damaged. The assumption was backward because I had never been told which pathway each substance operated through. 3 assumptions inverted by the physics of one receptor, each inversion running exactly opposite to the common belief. The mouth was never hot. The tolerance is cellular. The stomach is protected, not damaged. The remaining physics traces capsaicin beyond the gut, into the Scoville scale that measures the receptor's dose response, the endorphin payoff the regular spice eater craves, the medical application of the same molecule on the skin, and the honest physics for you if you have reflux. What do the Scoville numbers actually measure? Wilbur Scoville, 1912. Extract the capsaicinoids from a pepper, dissolve them in sugar water, dilute until a panel of tasters detects no burn. The number of dilutions required is the Scoville heat unit. A habanero at 5,000 Scoville heat units means the extract had to be diluted 5,000 times before the tasters could no longer detect the burn. A habanero at 200,000 required 200,000 dilutions. A Carolina Reaper at 1.6 million required 1.6 million dilutions before the TRPV1 receptors on the taster's tongue stopped firing. Scoville numbers measure what the receptor physics predicts. TRPV1 activation follows a sigmoidal dose-response curve. Below a threshold concentration, capsaicin molecules are too sparse to activate enough receptors for a perceptible signal. At the threshold, activation rises sharply across a narrow concentration range. Above the saturation point, additional capsaicin produces diminishing response because the available receptors are fully occupied. The steep middle portion of the sigmoid is the range where one additional jalapeno slice on the plate crosses from pleasant warmth to overwhelming burn. The narrowness of that range explains why spice tolerance feels binary: you are fine or you are on fire, with almost nothing in between. The sigmoid also explains why doubling the number of chili flakes on a pizza does not double the burn. Below the threshold, doubling the dose adds no perceptible heat. In the steep zone, doubling crosses from comfortable to overwhelming. Above saturation, doubling makes no difference because every receptor is already occupied. The response is not linear because the receptor binding that produces it is not linear. Why does the burn feel good after it stops hurting? And then, the endorphin payoff, the C5 nociceptive signal that capsaicin triggers through TRPV1 activation, is a genuine pain signal. The brainstem responds to pain signals by activating the descending inhibition pathway, endorphin release that produces system-wide analgesia and mood elevation. The warm calm that arrives 10 to 15 minutes after a spicy meal is the endorphin response to the pain the capsaicin triggered. The controlled pain discussion described this as descending inhibition, the brain releasing its own opioids in response to sustained nociceptive input. The spice high is pharmacologically real, measurable through pain threshold elevation in the minutes following capsaicin exposure. The craving for spicy food in habitual eaters may be partly a craving for the endorphin response the burn triggers. The timeline is consistent. The burn peaks within 2 to 3 minutes of the bite. The endorphin response builds over 5 to 10 minutes as the brainstem processes the sustained nociceptive input, and the warm calm arrives at 10 to 15 minutes. The sequence, pain followed by relief, followed by mild euphoria, is the same sequence the controlled pain discussion described for any sustained nociceptive stimulus. The food is the delivery mechanism. The receptor is the trigger. The endorphin system is the payoff. Capsaicin cream. The molecule in the pepper and the molecule in the prescription tube are identical. Capsaicin cream at 0.025 to 0.1% concentration. Prescribed for neuropathic pain, postherpetic neuralgia, and osteoarthritis. Depletes substance P from the nerve terminal through sustained TRP1 activation. The controlled pain discussion describes substance P as the pain neurotransmitter stored in vesicles at the terminal. Sustained capsaicin activation releases all available substance P, flooding the synapse initially, then depleting the terminal supply. The nerve can no longer signal pain until it resynthesizes substance P from scratch, a process that requires the cell body to manufacture new protein, transport it down the axon to the terminal, and package it into vesicles ready for release. The resynthesis takes hours to days depending on the nerve length and the completeness of the depletion. During the depletion window, the nerve terminal is physically incapable of transmitting the pain signal because the chemical messenger it needs to send the signal has been exhausted. The initial burn during application is the depletion event. The pain relief that follows is the empty terminal. The patient who quits during the burn phase quits during the therapeutic mechanism. The burn diminishes across 3 to 4 days of consistent application as the substance P supply depletes. By day 5 to 7, the area is pain-free because the terminal has exhausted its pain neurotransmitter. The relief lasts for hours to days after each depletion cycle, and repeated application maintains the depletion, providing sustained pain relief from a molecule that was originally identified in a kitchen, not a laboratory. The connection between the pepper and the prescription carried different weight. The afternoon, the substance P depletion became one molecule in 2 containers. The burn on the tongue and the burn on the arthritic knee are the same receptor, the same depletion, the same empty terminal. The kitchen and the pharmacy share a molecule because they share a receptor. Well, one final clarification if you have gastroesophageal reflux and have been told to avoid spice entirely. Capsaicin does not increase gastric acid production. Capsaicin does not cause reflux. The esophageal burn during reflux episodes is TRPV1 activation on esophageal nerve endings by capsaicin that was carried upward from the stomach with the refluxate. The capsaicin that was protective in the stomach, activating the mucosal defense messenger and increasing mucosal blood flow, becomes painful in the esophagus because the esophageal lining is thinner than the gastric lining by approximately half. The TRPV1 receptor density is higher in esophageal tissue, and the protective vasodilation response that strengthens the gastric barrier is anatomically weaker in the esophagus because the esophageal vasculature does not respond to the protective peptide with the same magnitude of blood flow increase the gastric vasculature produces. The spice did not cause the reflux. The reflux carried the spice to a location it was never meant to reach. Capsaicin amplifies the perception of existing reflux events without increasing the frequency or severity of the reflux itself. Bortolotti and Porta confirmed this in Alimentary Pharmacology and Therapeutics. Spicy food may worsen the experience of active, uncontrolled reflux by amplifying the TRPV1 signal in esophageal tissue. If your reflux is well controlled through management your physician has prescribed, spice may be tolerable because the capsaicin stays in the stomach, where its protective pathway operates. Whether spice is appropriate for your specific situation is a clinical conversation between you and your physician. The physics teaches what capsaicin does to each receptor in each organ. The physician determines whether your reflux is controlled enough for the gastric protection to outweigh the esophageal sensitivity. The decision is clinical. The physics is the same regardless of the decision. Understanding the physics allows you to describe your symptoms to your physician with precision. Spice increases the burn during reflux episodes, but does not increase the frequency of the episodes. Gives the physician specific information. The vague statement, "Spice bothers my stomach," does not. Mouth was never hot. The receptor was fooled by a molecule shaped like a temperature. The brain received a thermal signal from a chemical impersonation so precise that every downstream response deployed as though the tissue were burning. The tolerance was cells pulling receptors off their surface through decades of activation that the cuisine demanded and the genetics accommodated. The stomach was protected through a blood flow pathway the feared molecule activated. The burn was always real. The heat was always absent. If you avoid spice to protect the stomach, you are avoiding the substance that increases mucosal blood flow through the pathway the stomach uses to protect itself. If you cannot tolerate any spice, you carry more receptors, a thinner barrier, or both, hardware differences, the individual genetic set and the mucosal environment modified. The receptor could not tell the difference because the shape of the molecule was the only thing the receptor ever knew how to check.